It was the summer of 2025, and a small team of Italian researchers was staring at a radar screen in disbelief. For weeks, they had been sweeping the ground around the Great Sphinx of Giza with equipment far more sensitive than anything used on the monument before, expecting, at best, to confirm what earlier surveys had already hinted at decades ago. Instead, the screen returned something that shouldn't have been there: a void. Not a crack, not a natural fissure, but a defined, structured cavity sitting beneath the Sphinx's paws, with edges too clean, too geometric, too deliberate, to be an accident of nature. Within days, the images leaked online. Within weeks, they had reached millions of people, and a single question was suddenly on everyone's mind. What is actually down there, and why, after nearly a century of drilling, digging, and scanning this same ground, has nobody been allowed to find out? The Great Sphinx has survived sandstorms, empires, and thousands of years of argument. But this new data changed the conversation in a way that older surveys never quite managed to. It wasn't just another anomaly on a printout. It was a shape, a chamber-like void sitting directly beneath one of the most photographed, most studied, most argued over monuments on Earth. And for the first time in decades, serious researchers were using words like structured and man-made instead of inconclusive. Online, the reaction moved faster than any official statement could keep up with. Within hours, the image had been reposted by accounts with millions of followers, stripped of context, and turned into a single explosive claim. The Sphinx is hollow, and someone has known it for years. That single sentence, half true and half wild exaggeration, is exactly the kind of thing this monument has been generating for 2 centuries. And it's exactly why separating what the radar can actually prove from what people desperately want it to prove matters so much right now. To understand why this discovery landed like a shockwave, and why so many people online are convinced it's being buried on purpose, you have to understand what kind of monument the Sphinx actually is, how old it might really be, what has already been found beneath it, and why almost every answer anyone has ever offered about this stone has eventually run into a wall of official silence. The radar team behind the new findings called themselves the Khafre Project, led in part by Italian researcher Filippo Bondi, working alongside radar specialists including Corrado Malanga and Armando May. Their approach combined ground-penetrating radar with a technique called synthetic aperture radar tomography, essentially using satellite and ground data together to build a 3-dimensional picture of what lies beneath solid rock without ever touching a shovel to the ground. Before pointing their equipment at the Sphinx itself, the team ran a calibration test on a structure whose interior was already fully documented: the Osiris Shaft, a known multi-level chamber system beneath the Giza Plateau discovered decades earlier. According to the team, the radar mapped that shaft's known chambers and corridors with striking accuracy, which they argued proved the technology could be trusted on unexcavated ground. Then they turned it toward the Sphinx's paws. What came back was not a diffuse cloud of static or a shapeless smear the way natural fractures usually appear. It was something closer to a rectangle, a cavity roughly the size of a small room, sitting beneath the stone at a depth of several meters, with walls that read as unusually straight for something formed by geology alone. The team went public with what they called a confidence level, well above 80%, that this was a real structured void and not an illusion produced by faulty equipment. The reaction from mainstream Egyptology was immediate, and it was not gentle. Zahi Hawass, arguably the most prominent Egyptologist alive and the former head of Egypt's Antiquities Authority, dismissed the claims outright, stating publicly that radar of this kind simply cannot see the distances and details the team was describing, and accusing the researchers of publishing sensational claims without proper peer review or coordination with Egyptian authorities. He called the announcement irresponsible and reminded the public that no independent research team is authorized to publish findings about Giza without the approval of Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities, approval the Khafre Project never received. The clash escalated further when podcast host Joe Rogan pressed Hawass directly on the subject during a widely watched interview, pointing to the Osiris shaft calibration test as evidence the method deserved serious consideration. Hawass held his position, arguing that a successful test on one known structure does not prove the same technique can safely resolve details thousands of feet down through solid rock. No excavation has been authorized. No drill has touched the new anomaly. Earlier in 2025, the same broader research circle, working with Corrado Malanga and radar specialist Nicole Cicolo, claimed to have identified an entire subterranean complex reaching nearly 2 kilometers beneath the Giza Plateau, complete with what they described as spiral staircases, vertical shafts, and cube-shaped chambers arranged with unmistakable symmetry. That announcement triggered a wave of coverage across independent media, followed almost immediately by a wave of pushback from geophysicists who pointed out that no radar technology available today can reliably resolve structural detail at that depth through solid limestone bedrock. The Sphinx paw anomaly announced later that year landed inside that same atmosphere of distrust, which is part of why it detonated online instantly rather than quietly working its way through academic channels the way most archaeological findings do. This is not the first time this exact patch of ground has produced strange readings. In the early 1990s, geophysicist Thomas Dobecki and Egyptologist Mark Lehner ran their own seismic surveys around the enclosure, and their instruments also picked up unusual cavities beneath the front paws and along the flanks of the monument, shapes that struck some observers as too regular to be simple cracks in old limestone. NASA satellite imagery in the years since has flagged additional subsurface anomalies scattered across the wider Giza Plateau. And yet, across 3 decades, from the 1990s surveys to this year's radar controversy, Egyptian officials have consistently reached the same conclusion. The cavities are natural fissures in a plateau riddled with them, and drilling into fragile 4,500-year-old limestone to satisfy public curiosity is not a risk worth taking. Because the argument over what might be sitting in that void is inseparable from a much older argument, one that has never fully been resolved. How old is the Sphinx itself, and what has it actually lived through? The mainstream case is built on solid ground. Most Egyptologists date the Sphinx to Egypt's 4th dynasty, carved under Pharaoh Khafre somewhere around 2520 to 2494 BCE. The Valley Temple sitting immediately beside the monument was constructed from massive limestone blocks cut directly out of the Sphinx's own excavation trench, tying the two structures to a single coordinated building project. A diorite statue of Khafre was recovered from inside that same temple. Radiocarbon testing of Old Kingdom mortar samples from across the plateau, carried out through the 1980s and 90s, points consistently to the 3rd millennium BCE. None of those tests were run on the Sphinx's bedrock body directly, since it isn't organic material, but they support the same broad timeline the rest of the evidence points to. It looks like water erosion, the kind produced by heavy, sustained rainfall running down a vertical stone face over a long stretch of time. That claim mattered because the Sahara hasn't experienced that kind of regular heavy rain in thousands of years, meaning if West was right, the Sphinx would have to be standing already carved during a much older, much wetter period of North African climate. West brought in Boston University geologist Robert Schoch to evaluate the idea, and Schoch arrived expecting to disprove it. Instead, examining the enclosure walls up close, he found rounded surfaces and deep vertical channels consistent with flowing water, not the horizontal, pitted texture typical of sand erosion. Schoch and geophysicist Thomas Dobecki, the same researcher who later flagged the cavity anomalies, then ran seismic tests beneath the enclosure floor and found something striking. Weathering penetration on the north, east, and south walls measured roughly 1, 8 to 2, 5 meters, while the west wall showed only about 1, 2 meters. To Schoch, that asymmetry meant the front and sides had been exposed to the elements for far longer than the back, possibly because the west side was recut during a known ancient restoration, while the rest carried scars from a much earlier era. If he's right, the Sphinx's true origin could stretch back to the end of the last ice age, more than 11,000 years ago, when the Sahara was a landscape of grasslands and lakes rather than the desert it is today. Mainstream Egyptology pushed back hard, when its strongest counterargument centers on a process called salt crystallization. Egyptian limestone holds soluble salts that migrate to the surface when exposed to moisture and temperature swings, then crystallize and flake off in thin layers, producing rounded, softened profiles that can look remarkably like water damage. This isn't a theoretical objection. It's been reproduced in laboratories and documented extensively across other Egyptian monuments, and modern conservation reports list salt damage as one of the most serious ongoing threats to the Sphinx's survival today. There's also the issue of the stone itself. The Sphinx wasn't cut from a single uniform block. Its lower body came from softer, more porous limestone layers than its head, meaning it would naturally erode faster under any weathering process, water or otherwise. Add centuries spent buried under sand, which traps moisture against the stone and accelerates chemical decay, and the erosion becomes far easier to explain within the conventional timeline. Neither side has landed a knockout blow. Honest researchers on both sides admit the weathering evidence genuinely cuts both ways, and even Schoch himself has never claimed certainty, describing his work as raising a serious question rather than delivering a final verdict. There's also the question of material heterogeneity to weigh in this same debate. The Sphinx wasn't quarried from a single uniform layer of rock, and comparing its erosion against nearby structures can be misleading if those structures happen to be built from harder blocks, cut from higher, more resistant layers, which many of the surrounding temples were. That single detail alone accounts for a meaningful share of the difference in weathering that gets pointed to as evidence one way or the other. Some researchers push the age question much further than Schoch ever intended. Ukrainian scientists Vyacheslav Manichev and Alexander Parkhomenko pointed to horizontal notches on the enclosure walls that resemble wave-cut formations, the kind left behind by standing bodies of water at a consistent level over enormous stretches of time, and proposed an age approaching 800,000 years. That claim has found essentially no support in mainstream geology, and for good reason. It would require evidence of a civilization capable of monumental sculpture at a point in prehistory where no such evidence exists anywhere on the planet. Author Andrew Collins took a more measured middle path, suggesting that the stone itself might show genuine signs of ancient water exposure, while the actual carving into a human-headed lion could have happened much later, meaning the canvas is old but the sculpture on top of it might not be. It's a distinction worth holding on to because the age of the rock and the age of the artwork carved into it are not automatically the same number. What nobody disputes is that the Sphinx has been altered again and again across its long life. The most systematic modern excavation, led by French Egyptologist Émile Barrès in the 1920s and 30s, uncovered masonry repairs from multiple distinct eras. New Kingdom pharaohs, Thutmose IV and Amenhotep II, added limestone casing blocks to stabilize the crumbling body. More repairs followed during the Sate period around 600 BCE and again under Greco-Roman rule. Even 20th century conservation work used cement patches that failed and had to be replaced. The famous Dream Stele, placed between the Sphinx's paws by Thutmose IV around 1401 BCE, describes the young prince falling asleep in the monument's shade while it sat buried to the neck in sand, and dreaming that the Sphinx promised him the throne of Egypt if he cleared the sand away. He did, and he became pharaoh. Whatever else the stele is, part propaganda, part record, it proves that by the New Kingdom, more than 1,000 years after Khafre, the Sphinx was already considered ancient and in need of rescue. The sand always came back. For long periods, the Sphinx was buried past its shoulders, and while that burial protected the lower body from wind erosion, it also trapped moisture against the stone, feeding exactly the kind of salt damage that mainstream science points to today. The thing that hid it also wounded it. This layered, repeatedly modified history is the reason the new radar chamber is so hard to interpret responsibly. Any void found beneath the Sphinx could belong to the original Old Kingdom construction, a New Kingdom repair phase, a Sate-era intervention, or something added centuries later during one of the monument's many restorations. Without physical access, tool mark analysis, and material dating, there's no way to responsibly date what the radar is seeing, and that uncertainty is precisely the space that speculation rushes to fill. And speculation about the Sphinx's underworld has a very long, very tangled history. Go back to 1837 and you'll find one of the most repeated stories online, usually framed as French explorers finding a hidden doorway and covering it up. That's not what happened. A British expedition led by Colonel Richard William Howard Vyse drilled into the back of the Sphinx's head, and the drill rods jammed at around 27 feet. When the team tried blasting them free, they damaged the surrounding stone. Decades later, in 1978, archaeologists clearing the area found a fragment of the Sphinx's headdress sitting in the debris from that 19th century drilling. No secret door, just a scar from a rescue mission gone wrong. Mark Lenner and Zahi Hawass did later confirm a small, rough tunnel carved into the Sphinx's northwest rump, but it doesn't lead anywhere. It appears to be the work of treasure hunters or looters rather than the original builders, and it connects to nothing. The 2019 headlines about secret tunnels under Giza are another case of a real discovery getting mangled in translation. Those tunnels were found inside the Great Pyramid of Khufu, not the Sphinx, using muon imaging as part of the Scan Pyramids project, and later work in 2023 revealed a genuine hidden corridor above the pyramid's main entrance. Real findings, but about a completely different monument, and one that had nothing to do with the Sphinx despite being folded into the same viral narrative. The Osiris Shaft, a real multi-level underground structure accessed through a vertical passage beneath Khafre's causeway, is often confused with hidden Sphinx chambers as well, but it sits under the causeway, not the Sphinx, and the two are not connected. It descends through several levels, including a lower chamber that floods at the water table, and Hawass has published a full account of exploring it himself. It's genuinely dramatic. It's genuinely ancient. It's simply not the mystery people keep trying to attach it to. A separate strand of speculation comes from author Andrew Collins, who pointed to shallow natural cavities near an area north of the plateau known as the Tomb of the Birds, suggesting they might indicate a much larger cave network running beneath Giza. In 2009, Hawass responded directly, confirming that shallow cavities do exist there while firmly rejecting any suggestion that they form part of a massive underground city or connect in any way to the Sphinx. The site was subsequently sealed for conservation, which only added fuel to the idea that something was being hidden, even though the official explanation was simple preservation. Then there's Edgar Cayce, an American psychic active in the early 20th century, who claimed while in a trance that Atlantean survivors had buried a vast haul of ancient records beneath the Sphinx's right paw, complete with crystal technology and the lost history of humanity. He produced no physical evidence at all, yet the claim caught on and has been repeated in books, documentaries, and now viral radar posts for almost 100 years, resurfacing with renewed intensity every time a new scan makes headlines. It doesn't hold up to scrutiny, but it explains something important about why every new anomaly beneath this monument gets treated as a potential confirmation of a century-old prophecy rather than a data point that needs careful, boring verification. Even in 2022, the Sphinx generated a viral scare that had nothing to do with radar at all. Photographs began circulating online appearing to show the Sphinx with its eyes closed, as though the monument had somehow physically changed overnight. Egypt's Ministry of Antiquities moved quickly to state that the images had been digitally altered or captured from unusual angles that distorted the shadows across the face. Tourist photographs from the exact same days showed the Sphinx looking perfectly normal. The story reached millions of viewers within 72 hours and then vanished almost as fast. A small preview of exactly the kind of instant, uncritical amplification that met the 2025 radar claims a few years later. The Sphinx's face carries its own share of unresolved mysteries. The popular story blames Napoleon's soldiers for blasting off the nose with cannon fire during the French campaign of 1798, but that story is almost certainly wrong. Danish traveler Frederick Louis Norden sketched the Sphinx in 1737, more than 60 years before Napoleon set foot in Egypt, and the nose is already missing in his drawings. Chisel marks and drilled holes beneath the nostril suggest deliberate removal with hand tools, not a cannonball impact. The earliest written account comes from 15th century historian al-Makrizi, who recorded that a Sufi named Muhammad Sarim al-Dar disfigured the face in 1378 CE, after seeing locals leaving offerings to the monument, calling it idolatry, and was reportedly lynched for it afterward. It's the strongest surviving explanation historians have. The Sphinx's beard tells its own story of a later edition. Traces of red pigment on the face, along with the remains of a royal cobra emblem on the forehead, point to a brightly painted, unmistakably royal monument in its original form, nothing like the bare, weathered stone tourists see today. Ancient visitors would have looked up at a Sphinx blazing with color under the Nile Delta sun, not the pale limestone giant it has become. Even the Sphinx's proportions raise questions. Most Egyptian sphinxes have bodies roughly 3 head lengths long. The Giza Sphinx stretches closer to 5. Mark Leonard's detailed surveys point to a practical explanation rather than a mysterious one. A major natural fissure runs through the bedrock, and ancient builders had to extend the body forward to finish the rump and tail while avoiding that geological weakness. Some tool marks on the head do appear sharper than expected, and the harder limestone used there naturally resists weathering better than the softer body, which has led some researchers to wonder whether the head was recarved from an earlier, different form. It's possible. It isn't proven. And the surviving iconography, the cobra, the royal beard, the red paint, points overwhelmingly toward a solar, royal identity rather than any other figure some have proposed over the years. So where does that leave the radar chamber making headlines right now? Here's the honest picture. Mainstream archaeology's case for a 4th dynasty sphinx built under Khafre remains strong, anchored in the Valley Temple, the Khafre statue, and a plateau that reads as one coordinated project. Schoch's water erosion hypothesis, backed by real seismic asymmetry data, is a genuine unresolved geological challenge that has never been fully disproven, even if salt crystallization offers a credible, evidence-based alternative explanation for the same weathering. The 2025 and 2026 radar claims from the Khafre Project sit in an even messier position. The Osiris shaft calibration test is real and does lend the method some credibility. The confidence numbers the team has published are their own, self-reported, and have not been independently verified through peer review or physical excavation. Zahi Hawass's rejection carries real institutional weight, but it also comes from an authority that has repeatedly resisted opening new ground beneath this monument for decades, regardless of who was asking or why. What makes this moment feel worse than earlier controversies isn't that archaeologists have found something monstrous sealed away, some hidden Atlantean vault waiting to rewrite the history books overnight. It's that, for the first time in a generation, the gap between what independent researchers claim to see and what Egyptian authorities are willing to confirm has become this public, this loud, and this unresolved. There is a structured void, by multiple independent readings, sitting beneath one of the most recognizable monuments on the planet. Nobody outside a small circle knows what's actually inside it, whether it's empty bedrock, a forgotten storage room from some New Kingdom repair crew, or something nobody has adequately explained yet. And there is no announced plan from any official body to drill down, insert a camera, or send in anything that could actually settle the question for good. That's the part that should unsettle you more than any Atlantis theory ever could, and it's worth sitting with for a moment before reaching for the nearest dramatic explanation. The Sphinx has never stopped hiding things from us, not because of some ancient conspiracy, but because every generation that studies it inherits the same unfinished argument the last one left behind, adds its own new evidence and its own new noise, and then hands off one more unresolved chapter to whoever comes next. The stone has outlasted empires, floods, drought, war, tourists, treasure hunters, drills, and 100 years of competing theories about what it really is and what it was originally built to guard. It has survived every attempt to fully explain it. Whatever is actually sitting in that space beneath its paws right now, sealed, undisturbed, unentered, and completely unverified, the Sphinx has clearly been keeping it for a very long time. The only real question left is whether anyone in a position to authorize a drill is finally willing to find out, or whether this becomes one more anomaly added to a list that has been growing for 100 years, filed away, argued over endlessly online, and left, once again, unanswered, waiting patiently for the next generation of equipment and the next generation of stubborn researchers to try their luck against the same silent, patient stone. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.